Yes.
I call to order the meeting of the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District Board of Managers, August 12, 2021. This meeting is being convened electronically by Zoom pursuant to Minnesota statute section 13D.021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on current public health guidance, I have made the determination that it is not prudent for the Board of Managers, its committee staff, and members of the public to meet at the regular meeting location. All such meetings will be noticed and conducted in accordance with 13D.021 and all other applicable portions of the open meeting law. In addition, pursuant to that statute, all votes will be taken by roll call. And let's proceed with taking the attendance by roll call at this point. Manager Hejmati, Manager Loftus.
Here.
Manager Maxwell. Manager Miller. Manager Olson.
Here.
Manager Rognus. Oh, what? I'm looking at the old form. Manager Sando.
Here.
And Manager White is here. We have a quorum. Are there members of the public who wish to address the board in a matter not on the agenda? Then the next item is approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved. Olson.
Thank you, Manager Olson. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Manager Sando. Now we're voting on approving the agenda. Manager Hejmati, Manager Olson,
Aye.
Manager Miller, Maxwell, Manager Maxwell.
He just entered the meeting and he's connecting to audio.
Sure, I'll come back to him. Manager Loftus.
Aye.
Manager Sando.
Aye.
Manager White. Aye. Manager Maxwell. I was waiting for her to answer, whoever she was. Jean, you're muted. I'll accept a thumbs up.
How's that? Got it?
Very good. You're voting aye on the agenda, I hope?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Under information items, we have in our packet this evening the second quarter financial report, thanks to Ms. Johnson, and a draft of the 2022 budget and work plan in advance of the public hearing on August 26th. Under the consent agenda, there are two items. First is the approval of the July 22nd, 2021 board meeting minutes, and the second is resolution 21054, authorization to renew a license and maintenance agreement for the permitting software. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Move approval, Olson.
Manager Olson moves. Is there a second?
Maxwell second.
Thank you, Manager Maxwell. Voting on the consent agenda then, Manager White votes aye. Manager Sando?
Aye.
Maxwell?
Aye.
Loftus?
Aye.
Miller? Olson?
Aye.
Hejmati?
Aye.
Thank you all. When I do the president's report, I always talk about the meetings we've had. And of course, since our last regular meeting, we all went to the retreat, the board retreat on the 26th, which was a terrific in-person occasion for us to touch base, find out where we are, where we're going, what our next steps are, next projects. That was a great opportunity for us. And the liaisons to the joint liaisons of 325, Managers Maxwell and Hejmati and I also had a liaison meeting where we got an update on or kind of a recap on the charrettes and talked about the preliminary development agreement and what the next steps are going to be. Manager Loftus, we have a committee report.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. This evening we had a chance to discuss our campus improvements. We received a staff report. It's an ongoing project that includes exterior improvements to the facility for the watershed district. We're currently working with neighbors and navigating where that project might go. It is not formalized at this time, and so staff will continue their efforts and come back and provide an update to the board in September or later. So nothing definitive to report at this time, but we did receive a good update, and that is all we discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Evangelopoulos. The upcoming meeting and event schedule is printed in the agenda, but it does say held in boardroom, and that will be virtual until further notice. So the August CAC meeting, which had been was added back in, our new protocols every other month, but August was added back in so that they can have a 325 Blake Road conversation, get updated. And then the August 26th and September 9th committee and board meetings are shown there. The next item on the agenda is back to Ms. Damyantis-Lee after she was up in committee to give us an update on the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie Trail and interpretation design, give us a briefing and have some board discussion. Ms. Damyantis-Lee.
Thank you, President White, managers. I'll again share my screen quickly. Thank you. I'll see my presentation screen there.
Yes.
Again.
Yes.
Hey. Well, as President White mentioned, today I'd like to provide an overview of design direction for the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie Trail and interpretation, and also gather some feedback on that direction. As a reminder, the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie, which is shown in red here, is located in Miniaturistic, and it sits just north of 6 Mile Marsh, which is then just upstream of Halstead Bay of Lake Minnetonka. The property comprises 210 acres, of which the district has restored about 130 and then subsequently managed over the last 9 years. This evening, I'd like to cover an overview of the project and the priorities that have been guiding design up to this point, a summary of input that staff received from the Policy and Planning Committee meeting in January, and that's informed certain design decisions. Some feedback that staff received during a community engagement event that was held earlier this month, and then also from Miniaturistic City Council when staff provided an overview of the project earlier in August, and also what we've learned from our coordination with our project partners, how design development has progressed for both the trail and the site interpretation, and I'll also ask for the board's reaction to the design direction up to this point, and then also provide an expected timeline for us to reach design completion and then also for construction bidding. Just a little bit of background on this project. The original Capsule project itself dates back to 2012 when the district purchased 210 acres that were formerly 2 farmsteads. The wetlands on the site had been tiled and drained and were being farmed along with most of the uplands of the site, except for a few pockets of oak woodlands. The intent of the original capital project was to restore the property by breaking the existing drain tile, which then allowed the wetlands to expand to their historic extent. And after 3 years of intensive vegetation management, including seeding and herbicide application, mowing, and prescribed burning, this led to an establishment of a really diverse native plant community that's provided both water quality improvements and habitat improvements. The 30% design plans for the Capsule project also included a plan sheet for the future construction of a pedestrian trail through the site. This was contemplated to be an out and back spur trail that would lead users from the Dakota Rail Regional Trail onto the Prairie property. Some initial planning and community engagement went into this effort in 2013, but at that time, the district decided to not implement trail construction to allow time for the vegetation to establish within the restoration. The remaining $125,000 in the capital project budget was then carried forward, and then a December 2020 budget amendment allowed the project budget to be increased to about $348,000 to accommodate interpretive planning, design, and fabrication, as well as trail construction and some minor site improvements. And that brings us to the work that's currently in front of us. That was initiated in March with a request for proposals and also a competitive selection process through which Damon Farber Landscape Architects was selected to lead design of a trail through the Prairie and then also connect to the regional trail. The project also includes development of custom site interpretation and some minor site improvements. Following there we go. Following early design guidance provided by the Policy and Planning Committee meeting in January, staff have been guiding design development under some primary considerations. And those are that the natural character of the site, its sort of sweeping views, the diversity in plant life, the array of wildlife is really highly valued by the community. And these resources are sensitive to disturbance. And that should indicate that we would use a light touch on the site, not only in construction activities to construct the trail, but also in the scope and scale of the project itself. Also, through maintenance of a temporary mode trail that's covered the western half of the site, we've seen consistent but really light usership, which indicates to staff that the design of the trail and the interpretive elements should really capitalize on both the regional trail users and also people that will come to see the site as a destination over time and then access the property from Halstead Drive. There's only about 750 people within a 15-minute walk shed of the property, but we know from Three Rivers Park District that between 350,000 and 400,000 people use the trail, regional trail, annually. So there's a potential for greater visitation once people are aware of the site. Also, because the property is so unique in this rapidly developing landscape, people may begin to sort of seek it out as a destination for birding or viewing wildlife. Also, in thinking about how to best interpret the site, our guiding principles have been that interpretation should really create a meaningful engagement with landscape that some people can feel overwhelmed by or sort of unfamiliar with, and that the landscape, while it is expansive, there are also these kind of intricate and observable features that we should take notice of. We also think that interpretation should be reflective of the unique characteristics of the site and how these characteristics are really underpinned by water. And that these elements really match the high design standards that we set with interpretation at Wasserman Lake Preserve, but also be customized to this very unique site. And also that the scope of interpretation shouldn't overpower this kind of beautiful rustic character of the site, but really complement it and then also cause people to connect with the site. Lastly, I'm thinking about trail design and selecting materials for interpretation. We're working towards durability and minimal maintenance, and that it's sort of an overarching design goal is that it's being driven by the interpreting the site within the context of the 6 Mile Creek Halstead Bay subwatershed. At first, the site appears to be primarily upland. You don't think about water necessarily when you first get on the site, but really the site's cultural history and its use was really defined by water. The site is really currently defined by water in its restored wetlands, and the prairie topography that connects the 6 Mile Marsh, which then connects to 6 Mile Creek, and the site's habitats and wildlife, those are all really strongly influenced by the presence of water on the site and then near the site as well. And trying to get this to advance. There we go. Interestingly, we heard a lot of these same themes during a community engagement meeting that we held on July 6th. The community expressed a really strong interest in design that would limit disturbance to the site during construction and also advocated for limited interventions to protect the sensitive resources on the site. The questions that were raised were primarily about the scope of the project and sort of what the anticipated timeline was. And people were also interested to know about potential connections to the future regional trail extensions to the east. I will say that really the goal of this project is to provide an access to our site, to the prairie from the regional trail, and not really is to serve as a connection to the future connections that are planned to the east of the site. We also presented a design overview to Miniaturistic City Council on August 2nd. And council very much expressed their excitement about this new resource to their city and asked questions about possible connections to the Turtle Creek neighborhood to the south of the prairie. I'll note that possible connections were explored when we undertook design in 2012, but those options were sort of set aside because there is an existing sidewalk that connects to the regional trail from this neighborhood. And site topography between this neighborhood and the prairie itself is pretty dramatic, and it just really doesn't allow for trail alignment without significant grading. Lastly, there are a number of observations made by Damon Farber early in design that have really shaped design direction. And those are sort of laid out on this graphic here. First, Damon-Farber felt a strong need to align the trail to allow users to view the wetlands, but also avoid encroachment on the buffers of the wetlands and avoid wetland disturbance generally. Damon-Farber thought that it was important also to route the trail to a high point on the western side of the property, which allows this beautiful long view across many habitats, but then also kind of focus our views away from the residential development to the south, that Turtle Creek development. They also thought it was important to allow users to view 6 Mile Marsh and make that watershed connection, but also it's important to avoid the wetlands on the site and acknowledge that we won't be able to get users to 6 Mile Marsh, but still experience it from a specific point of viewing. They also found it important to bring the trail to the historic barn on the site because it's just a really natural gathering space. And they also wanted to route the trail away from Halstead Drive, which since it's been paved, it can be noisy, but also still utilize the existing parking area at the entrance drive. So focusing that broad direction, Damon-Farber has proposed a trail design that considers a really meaningful experience of the site and also safety and also long-term maintenance. The alignment and surfacing of the trail itself really goes toward promoting low-impact pedestrian use. It should encourage a slow pace through a variety of habitats within the site, and then also follow an optimal length loop. It should allow for accessibility as well, and also really reduce site disturbance, really provide for minimal long-term maintenance and the associated costs with long-term maintenance. So the result of incorporating all of these considerations is the trail alignment that's shown here in brown, the brown line here. The new trail will connect to the Dakota Rail Regional Trail on the western side of the site, indicated by the red circle here. The first 25-foot section within the tree line on the Hennepin County Regional Rail Authority property will be built to typical regional trail standards, and that's the 10-foot width and bituminous surface. And then once the trail moves into sort of the open prairie, we'll taper the trail to a 6-foot width and then transition to a decomposed granite aggregate surface. As you move along the trail from west to east, you get to sort of a high point right about here. And this allows users to sort of enter the site through this beautiful valley, and then you kind of get the sense that you're enveloped by the prairie, and then a gentle rise to this high point that allows, again, a beautiful long view south towards 6 Mile Marsh, and then the trail crosses the existing access road here, and then brings users to this the historic barn on the site, which, like I mentioned, is a really natural gathering space. From that point, users can either traverse kind of in the same alignment towards 6 Mile Marsh and the kind of eastern extent of the trail alignment here, and loop around between these two beautiful wetlands on the site. And then they can return back to the historic barn or follow the loop the other direction, and then either go out back towards Halstead Drive, the trailhead location and parking that's there, or continue on the existing spur trail back out to the regional trail. And then turning to the themes behind design development next. We really think that the naturalized site is kind of beautiful on its own and in its existing state, but is really defined by the space and scale of the property and that unique rustic character. We also think that the range of stories to tell is really broad. It's had a long history. It's had a number of different uses over time, and there's just a really cool history to tell within the site. We also think that the interpretation should be consistent with the standard set at Wasserman, but also be specific to this very unique site. And then also, we want to make sure that we're finding the right balance between thoughtful interpretation without altering the natural character of the site. So part of Damon-Farber's design process included identifying various audience types and priorities for engaging those audiences, and then also connecting the content depth appropriate for these audiences. This is sort of the process that they worked through in identifying those audiences. Design decisions then were guided by the goals of providing these multiple ways of engagement, whether a user is coming to the site one time or comes to the site multiple times over the course of the year, and having many layers of engagement by encouraging exploration through different types of content that you can either experience with kind of a casual visit or someone who's maybe more interested in learning about the site. We're also making sure that we're creating interpretation that's relevant to the changing seasons. We expect that people will visit the site through spring, summer, fall, and then even use the site in the winter as well. And then I'd like to share this graphic, essentially to indicate where the areas of interpretation will be, but obviously the trail alignment has changed since this graphic was developed. The interventions will be essentially 2 entry points, as I mentioned, one at Halstead Drive here, and then one at the regional trail here. The first interpretive area along the trail will be this ecological transect at this high point of the prairie here. And then the trail will bring users again to the barn, which will be another interpretive area. And then the third and final location is this long view over 6 Mile Marsh. So the first piece I'd like to share is about the trailheads. The information shared on these trailhead locations will be primarily informational in nature, essentially a little bit about the site, that people are entering property of the watershed district, some information about the restoration of the site, how the site connects to the larger 6 Mile Creek Halstead Basin watershed, a simple trail map that kind of shows people where they are and what they can expect as they experience the trail. And then those, again, will be at both the regional trail location, that connection point there, as well as Halstead Drive. Something we've been considering as we've been reviewing design plans is that likely the interpretive area or the trailhead location off of Halstead Drive will be more substantial, will look more like an entry into a site, something that's visible by drivers, as opposed to the trailhead at the regional trail, which will be smaller in scale and more suited to a trail user on foot or on a bike. And as I mentioned, the first interpretive element will be this ecological transect location, which is at this high point on the prairie that has this view over many habitats. In the foreground will be sort of the rolling prairie, then beyond that, this open water wetland, and then beyond that, an oak savanna above 6 Mile Marsh, and then you can even see the Miniaturistic water tower in the distance. The view is essentially kind of captured by this graphic here, seeing many habitats across a kind of long view across the site. And that's the sort of long view that you get being out on the prairie. This ecological transect essentially has 2 portions. The first is the series of weathering steel panes that will be inset in the ground. And it sort of invites users to walk out into the prairie and kind of really get up close and personal with the various plants and elements of the prairie. The threshold is made from these plates with stainless steel behind them, and they'll have engraving or cutouts within the steel plates. And that messaging will be specific to things to notice sort of at ground level, plant and insect species, animal tracks, movement of water, that sort of thing. And then as you follow that transect out into the prairie, you'll reach this upright frame, which sort of focuses your view across the landscape and then will indicate distance to specific features beyond, as I mentioned, the distance to the open water wetland, and then to additional prairie out to 6 Mile Marsh, and then the water tower in the distant view. Then the second interpretive element, as I mentioned, will be at the historic barn. This is, again, a really natural gathering space and somewhere that we like to include in our interpretive elements. In addition to some simple benches or picnic tables within the area, the barn itself will be used for interpretation of the cultural history of the site. So the sense here is that these small viewing portals will be cut into the barn structure itself. And then to the interior of the barn will be affixed these steel frames and then an acrylic insert that is engraved with these 4 depictions of the cultural history of the site will be put into these steel frames. The idea is that a viewer would stand on the outside of the barn and kind of look into the barn and get these images on these within these frames. The cultural history of the site will be interpreted within these 4 frames. First, the inhabitation by indigenous people, then the agricultural use, its current conversion to a restored landscape, and then how the site might be used in the future or changed in the future. And then, as I mentioned, the final interpretive node is located at the trail's easternmost point and allows this beautiful long view over 6 Mile Marsh, which is this view here. And this watershed moment has two parts, essentially. Trail users will first encounter a topographic relief map of the watershed with some content about the restoration and its connection to the watershed as a whole, and then the water quality improvements throughout the subwatershed. And then the second piece of this interpretive node is what we're calling sky loungers. And they essentially allow trail users to get out to the end of the trail to pause and rest and then take a different view of the landscape in. We're thinking that these sky loungers will essentially be at two positions. One that allows users to sort of look out over 6 Mile Marsh, and the other position will be slightly reclined, and that will allow users to view the sky and the marsh together. And the idea here is that people kind of pause to contemplate the interaction of land and water. I'd like to touch briefly on the material choices and the basis for those decisions. The interpretive elements will be constructed primarily of very durable materials, primarily using core 10 steel and a small amount of wood for the picnic tables. This is in consideration of the fact that the site really is remote and is managed by prescribed fire. The pedestrian trail will be designed with the input of a geotech expert, and we'll have a base section and then a decomposed granite surface. And working with the existing topography to the extent possible, the trail will also include a cross slope to minimize erosion. And annual maintenance will likely include some trail edge mowing, and only in the event of a major precipitation event would repair be necessary. And that would include bringing in a small amount of crushed granite and compacting that into place. With kind of the summary of the interpretive elements here, I'd certainly be happy to pause here and answer any questions that are related to the alignment and design.
Thank you. I've been eagerly awaiting this presentation.
Will Minihaha Creek Watershed District logo be on the signage so people know who's sponsoring it?
That's a great question, Manager Sando. Yes, we certainly intend to include either the logo or some indication that it's the property of the Watershed District, so there is that connection.
Super.
President White, and then Manager Maxwell has his hand up after you.
Manager Maxwell?
Oh, will this be open to cross-country skiers during the winters?
Manager Maxwell, managers, yes. While the trail won't be maintained in the winter, we won't do grooming or that sort of thing. We'd certainly be open to people snowshoeing or doing kind of typical cross-country skiing activities on site.
Okay, so we weren't going to groom it. That's kind of my question. If they were expected to be groomed, it wasn't going to happen. And then the next question is, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, we intended to sort of follow the maintenance standards of the regional trail. That trail is not maintained in the winter either. People do snowshoe and ski on that trail, but they don't do grooming or things like that.
Okay. And then the next question is on the barn. Do we have, is there restrooms going to be available around that area?
Manager Maxwell, no, we didn't intend to provide for restrooms there. I guess we're sort of considering the site to be kind of a nature preserve, that people will kind of come and pack in and pack out their trash and use restrooms. There is a regional trail trailhead just south of the Prairie in St. Bonifacius where there are restroom facilities. And then up the trail a little ways is Galewoods Farm, which also has restroom facilities. So they are nearby. Okay,
then the last part of that would be, what kind of, is that barn going to be completely locked up where we don't have greater liability? And to make sure that nobody could break into there or get in there, up to the loft or something like that?
Manager Maxwell, yes. It is currently locked and blocked off, so there isn't access to the barn. We have had some incidences of vandalism where the barn door has been pried off or the lock has been pried off. And we've talked internally about reinforcing that door that we need access through, but perhaps putting a different door on or a different lock system on.
All right, thank you.
I have a follow-up question, if I'm not interrupting anybody else, regarding the barn.
Go ahead, Manager Sando.
Thank you. Laura, considering the barn, have you thought of any security cameras, 1 or 2 on a post, just because of the vandalism? More people using it, more people are aware of it.
I understand, managers, that's a great idea. And it is something that we've implemented at some projects that have been tampered with previously, a cart barrier specifically. So it's something we could certainly look at if vandalism does continue to be an issue on the site. Our hope certainly is that with more visitation to the site, it won't be seen as such a remote site where people might be able to get away with damaging the property. I really hope that that's the case and that we don't need to go to the step of installing security cameras, but that would certainly be an option.
Manager Olson.
Thank you. Taking off on an idea that Gene Maxwell had during our committee meeting, do we avoid any risk of having somebody come in and tell us it's not accessible by wheelchair because of the crushed rock?
Manager Olson, that's a good question and something that we thought about a lot during design. In Damon Farber's experience, this decomposed granite does compact very well. The fine material in the decomposed granite has a much higher ratio to the typical class 5 gravel material, limestone gravel. And so with use, it will compact very well and be more accessible. Unfortunately, there aren't ADA standards for outside spaces. And so we sort of have to use what's available, when they relate to what would be used sort of as an interior space. And so in this case, we hope that the width and also the fact that we're using a decomposed granite surface and following some very gentle grades within the site will make it accessible.
Okay.
Laura, how does, I think I know the Genesis Manager Olson's question, because the City of Victoria is interested in revisiting some of the crushed rock trail that they put in at Wasserman Park based on ADA concerns that have been raised. What's the difference or similarity in the material used there versus here?
Good question. Same material, decomposed granite surface was used at Wasserman as well. And we have asked Damon Farber if we do sort of run into an issue later on, if this surfacing isn't appropriate for use, becomes a maintenance issue, or there is interest in future paving. What we're constructing now is great base material for future paving. So we could easily convert to a paved surface if that was the choice.
Yeah, because excuse me, but we're not able to easily convert over at Wasserman over the existing crushed granite. The way that is being proposed by our contractor is that we remove the granite and then we dig down 6 feet and put in class 5 and then pave it. And we're getting, quotes in the $140,000 range. And so it's getting awkward for the city. The good thing that the watershed had was the history of us recommending that in the first place and the city not wanting it. And then now the city's embarrassed because one of the former city council members can't go see the island. So it's become a point of debate.
Manager Olson, that's a good thing to consider. In this case, I'll touch base with Anna and confirm this. But I do know for the case of the trail that's to be constructed on the Prairie, we will have a base material of class 5. I don't have that graphic in front of me, but the design plans from Damon Farber show, I believe it's a 5-inch depth of class 5 base that's compacted with a decomposed granite on top of that. We're not just going right on the parent material. So Damon Farber's opinion when asked was that the existing trail could easily be paved. So maybe it's the difference in base material between the two trails.
Okay. Yeah, because I don't think there's any class 5 underneath that gravel.
Chair White and managers, that it's the subsurface correction that's the challenge at Wasserman. That didn't occur when the change order, the recommended change in material wasn't selected. So when it wasn't opted to go into a bituminous layer, they no longer needed the subsurface treatment. You also do have just the difference in natural subsurface materials in an upland prairie versus that low lobe that moves down to that wetland area, which creates a greater challenge and a need for soil correction at Wasserman.
Okay, last question then. Let's assume we use the crushed granite and we have it in there, and you said with use. Is there any way that we can use vibratory compactors to start off with it compacted? Instead of waiting for people to walk on it, just have the people.
Manager Olson, your video froze there, but I believe I get the gist of your question. Yes, we do intend to have a contractor compact both the base material as well as decomposed granite surface that will be plate compacted.
He seems satisfied with your response.
No, just agreeing.
You might have lost the bill.
Did he throw up confetti too again?
Gene, what I was talking, what'd you say?
I asked if Bill threw up confetti again.
Are there other thoughts?
Oh dear. We're getting bandwidth issues from somebody. Sherry, we can't hear you. Bill got kicked out of the meeting. While Sherry's internet comes back on, let's go to Deep Haven and try Manager Loftus, who has her hand raised.
Thank you. My question is on the first node, the image where excuse me, the person is going either left or right at a 90-degree angle to for an alternative view from the path. I really like the barn, what we're doing there with it, and I like the getting to the end of the trail and providing a view spot. I'm not sure if you could walk me through a little more thoroughly what's getting accomplished at this one, and you know, having 3 nodes in a mile, and if that's accomplished somewhere else. I'm just struggling with, would somebody be walking down the trail, they'd decide to turn to the right, and then they'd cross again the trail and go to the left and stand there for a while. Can you walk me through that experience or what we're accomplishing at that first node, please?
Certainly, Manager Loftus. Managers, the idea here is that the trail, you know, it does traverse the prairie, but there, you know, there will be a little bit of a shoulder on the trail, and its width is broad, and so you don't really feel kind of enclosed by the prairie. The idea with this transect is that you're kind of walking out into the prairie, which can, you know, in some cases be sort of over your head. And another thing to kind of consider with this is that, as I mentioned, I think people can feel very overwhelmed by the prairie. It's this expansive landscape. It feels very wide open. And the idea with having your feet kind of be focused, or your view to be focused sort of at your feet, is that you're noticing things at ground level. The inscriptions on these weathering plates will, you know, kind of encourage you to look at a plant species that's right there, or an insect species that you might see, or an animal track that you might see. So giving you to sort of focus at ground level rather than kind of taking in the entire prairie. And then once you sort of walk out this short distance out into the prairie a little bit, then you're faced with this frame essentially that will focus your view. And because of the location of this interpretive element, you have this beautiful long view over these open water wetlands and 6 Mile Marsh beyond, and the water tower beyond that. And the idea there is that you're looking through this frame that kind of focuses your view in that direction. The idea here again is to sort of, you know, kind of pull the prairie closer to make it more observable. And hopefully people will kind of then connect with sort of the smaller pieces of the prairie as well as the kind of open landscape.
Is it identical both directions then?
That's a good question. My sense is that it should not be. You know, in one view kind of shows you the items I mentioned. If you turn and looking the other direction, you're seeing an open water wetland behind you, the regional trail beyond that. So my sense is that content will be different as you turn the other direction because the views are different. What you might see in that direction is different. That content is still conceptual at this point and something we're kind of working through.
But the intent is going to be identical, both
The
directions.
intent is identical. Yes, the actual structures are identical. Yes.
Okay. I guess that one's not my favorite, but I really like the other two.
Other comments and questions at this pause point, either building off Manager Loftus's thread or something different?
Well, maybe just for Jessica, then what would you like then if you didn't like those? What else could you do?
I don't know. I think my question would be, you know, it's a 1 mile loop. You're probably fine with 2 nodes. I don't know. It seems like maybe it's a little bit of a stretch. I don't know that you have to come up with something. It can be just beautiful in nature and people are out on the trail in a rural area to begin with. I don't know that they're expecting intense interpretation on a 1 mile loop, but I don't know if there's a strong need for something right there. It's not that I don't welcome it. That one just doesn't speak to me as much. That's all.
So maybe have the landscaper look at it again, just to see if there's a different alternatives to come up with.
Manager Maxwell, Manager Loftus, yeah, certainly. And we're at about 60% design currently. We received our 60% design plans last Thursday and have been reviewing them. And there's still definitely opportunities for adjusting things. We're not locked into anything at this point. And that's, you know, certainly can be informed by, you know, this discussion and staff's impressions of these items as well. Yeah, nothing is set in stone at this point. Certainly the opportunity is to kind of adjust things as needed.
Then I think it would make sense to have the landscaper look at it again and say, you know, if you had some different thoughts between then and now, what would you change on it?
And Manager Maxwell, I'm sorry, Chair White.
I'll let you speak first, Michael, then I'll speak.
Thank you. Apologies, Chair White and Manager Maxwell. I think that's a great point, and we can speak with Damon Farber in more detail on that. The one thing that's really hard to communicate in presentation in 2D and why they selected this particular location is because it's the most compelling view on the entire prairie. It is the highest point of the prairie, and so when you look out over the 200 acres that the district owns, this is one of the few nodes you can actually see across the entire transect of the property. So they're trying to bring together, I think, not only the transect and how water connects all of those biomes, but also the scale of the prairie, the wetland, and the distance between things that are actually very difficult to see with your eye. You don't understand the actual distance to the water tower, to that large bur oak, to that wetland, the broken drain tile. And so they were trying to bring some sort of texture to that and help a user who might be out on the site where you finally have this really vast view shed after coming off of that Dakota Regional to understand actually the area that you're looking over and how far you're actually seeing and how these things are all connected by water. So
Yeah, it's basically just to have someone look at it and say, wow, this is amazing how much it covers and how vast everything is. Okay.
That's right.
In addition to
I like your point, Michael. Sorry, Sherry.
That's okay.
I was just going to say, I appreciate that point. It made me wonder though, are we sure that view isn't going to change with some beautiful housing development addition in the future?
Manager Loftus,
in either
thankfully,
direction?
this view is primarily, you get the sort of, you're looking southeast over the prairie at this point. And so a lot of that land is the watershed district's property. And then 6 Mile Marsh beyond that, which will obviously never be developed. And then sort of the very long view here is the water tower, which will maintain it, you know, it'll be a fixture on the landscape as well.
Don't maybe be able to see that 14-foot tower at 325 Blake.
14-story.
Yeah.
In addition to the scope and the variety of areas or little ecosystems within the area, Laura mentioned the height of the vegetation. That prairie vegetation can easily be 8 feet tall. And I was intrigued with the idea of having this little transect, I guess you called it, to get out and really experience that in a more better way even.
Those are great perspectives. What I heard from Manager Loftus was maybe less confusion about after it was explained about the concept for the transect, and more just a sentiment of what's the appropriate balance on site of the number of interpretive elements. So I think, I'm sure Laura and Mike will have a conversation with Damon Farber about other options, but it seems like maybe one of the root questions or concerns that's being brought up is just balance. So that would be more about being careful and intentional about the level of programming, and staff would be thinking about phasing which elements go in and holding one back. Maybe the board members want to speak to the question of balance on the site, if I heard Manager Loftus correctly.
James, you always say it better than me. Thank you.
No, I'm just trying to get to the root of it so that we can have a discussion around your point. I think you seem to understand the concept, but if it's about balance, maybe we can hear from the board how they feel about the balance on site.
Well, for me personally, I'd like to go out and look at it again. Because I mean, pictures it doesn't, you can look at it, but so you got to look at something, which direction you're looking at and everything else. It's hard to just say, oh, this is really going to be great without kind of visually looking at something. So that's just a difficult thing to do right now. But I'd like to go out and look at it again. But if I don't go out there with somebody that knows what I'm looking at, or this is how it's going to shape, then I'd get lost out there.
I know the consultant has spent time out there and staff has spent time out there, and I really appreciate the perspective that it's the high point and there's a lot to take in and see. It maybe just seems like a little, as James helped clarify, seems like a little much to have 8 footings and 2 different directions of interpretation at 1 of 3 nodes on 1 mile trail. So I just question, like, not that the elements are natural, but what is the goal right there, and is it a separate and distinct goal from the other 2 places that we're putting interpretation? I think I appreciate giving people a place to stop and look. I don't know if that's more important than at the end giving them a rest spot, but it seems like a lot in a short area. But that's just my opinion in 1 mile. But maybe people who would be going on this trail would be looking for a heavily interpreted meadow and watershed view. I don't know. It seems like a lot to me, but if everybody else is comfortable with it, then I'm certain that the consultant has spent time on what's best there, but I also know sometimes they design to your budget. So I just want to make sure it's, like James said, balanced with a natural environment.
That's great feedback, and Laura can take that in context of the feedback we've heard from other board members and work with Mike and the design team to scrutinize the programming that's been planned so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just add that, certainly it's been our intention right along to make sure that the amount of interpretation, the scale of it, and kind of where it's placed within the site to really be sensitive to the fact that the site is really beautiful on its own currently. We want the interpretation to complement the site as opposed to overwhelming it. So certainly, when you start to kind of think about, weighing options, we'll certainly take a closer look at that in particular. And certainly I would invite anyone to walk the site and kind of take it in and kind of see what the scale and scope is. We are currently maintaining that mode trail off the regional trail, and there's that little parking area right up in Halstead Drive that you can access the site from as well.
Before President White, I think Manager Hejmati has a question next, but Laura, maybe that's something that if there are managers who are interested out there, that you could just block an hour and let them know when you might be out there to kind of orient them on site so that people know where some of these elements are actually proposed to be. I think Manager Hejmati had a question next, Sherry.
Thank you, Manager Hejmati.
Yes, thank you. I'm also thinking of, when the amount of detail we put on these, on the different interpretive elements depends to some extent also on who the audience is, who's going to be coming there. And I'm wondering if we're considering that this could be a site where kids might come on a school trip, for example, if not now, maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I'm thinking ahead when there's probably going to be more development, in the Western area, which is where it is headed. And if that is so, then we want enough detail in there that the kids who come to look at it can get a sense and an appreciation of the complexity of something. Just looking at it is hard to understand that complexity. And if they can be in touch with that, what a nice way for them to understand nature and work to protect it in the future. So I would go, a different direction and say have enough details so that kids can get a taste of it and appreciate it, and hopefully it'll seed them to protect nature and the environment.
Andrew Hejmati, that's something that our design consultant has thought about a lot. David Farber is using DreamLab, Terry Quant, as its interpretive consultant. And Terry feels as if that this site needs to be built around everyone who will experience the site, age-wise, ability-wise, how people like to experience things. Even if you're, just kind of casually walking, encouraging people to stop and smell things, to listen for things, that sort of thing. And so with the interpretation, having kind of those layered elements that, even if you're looking very quickly by something, you'll notice it. But if you want to spend a little more time in exploring, the interpretation will foster that as well. And she considers that sort of be kind of a layered experience, that if you come to the site again and have more time to spend, that you'll notice something different. The interpretation should support that.
Excellent, excellent. And this is where, in terms of balance, excellent. I'm so glad that that's being done. I congratulate you on doing that. It's very thoughtful and very forward thinking. And so I would make sure that there's enough detail on there. So, when we're talking about balance, when we're talking about is there too much detail, I would say make sure there's enough detail so people can really appreciate it. So I'd be talking about the other side of it. Thank you for sharing that, Laura. It's a very thoughtful approach.
I'd like to agree with that, in that oftentimes you have to tell people what, especially young children, what they're looking at. Sometimes a young child looks at it and all they see is green grass, but if you give them little details to perk their their minds, they can appreciate it more. So I think it looks very good, the whole program.
Manager Maxwell, Manager Loftus have their hands up. I'm not sure if they're just staying up. Do either of you have questions or comments before Laura moves on?
No, I just didn't put my hand down.
No problem.
Same, sorry.
Laura, did you get what you needed from this section, or?
You did. That's great input. Yeah, I think this is an excellent time to kind of be having this conversation before we kind of make our final decisions about design direction on all these elements. And so, yeah, this has been very helpful, of course. I just wanted to touch really quickly on the project budget. As I mentioned, our current budget for the entire project, design and construction, is just under $348,000. Our known costs right now are in design and construction oversight, as well as the work to delineate the wetlands on the site and also do a topographic survey. And that comes out to about $65,000 roughly. That leaves us with a construction budget of about $278,000. Our current construction estimate sits at about $272,000. This was based on a construction estimate developed by a third-party estimator, someone who's familiar with sort of current costs in the industry, material costs, that sort of thing. And so while this is an estimate, we feel generally fairly confident with this number. I will be getting updated cost estimates tomorrow. Unfortunately, the estimator was not able to develop those today. But we anticipate the costs will come in right around this range, in which case we may have to reduce the number of interpretive elements or the scale of interpretive elements. Another option would be to shorten the trail length or maybe phase in some of the interpretation. But knowing that we are kind of nearing our construction budget, we just want to make sure that we're dialing in costs as closely as possible before we go out to bid. And with that, I just want to share a little bit about the timeline that we're looking at. We expect to wrap up design by the end of the month and also be completing our regulatory and coordinating agency approvals. And then on the September 23rd board meeting, we'll be seeking approval of the 90% plans and also getting authorization to solicit bids at that time. To hopefully solicit a good bid price, we're offering the option of either fall 2021 or spring 2022 construction. We feel as if contractors are offered the opportunity to either phase construction, maybe do preparation for the trail, do the base material of the trail this winter, and then complete the remainder of the trail surfacing and installation of the interpretive elements in the spring, or just move construction to spring entirely. It might get better bid prices. So we're offering that option with the bid. And then looking at either construction this fall or in the spring, and then have the trail be opened with a ribbon cutting in May or June of next year. And if there are any final questions, I'm happy to take them. But again, I'm very grateful for all the input and kind of how you've helped us kind of focus our next steps in this process.
I kind of like the approach about winter bidding and spring start. You're going to come up with some little better bids, I think, too. Because right now everybody seems to be fairly busy, so that you're going to get a better when they're over the winter. They're a little hungry for jobs, and you got to line up jobs. So I think that'll be a better time. I kind of like that approach better. Manager
Maxwell, managers, yes. Our design consultant has indicated that this might be a really good kind of filler project coming in at the tail end of kind of the heavy construction season. This construction window would probably be 6 to 8 weeks, so it might be something nice to kind of wrap up their construction season with.
Is there anything else on this item before we move along? Well, thank you very much, Laura. That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The